Buenas tardes, good afternoon to one and all who have joined us today for this webinar. My name is Carlos Vargas Ramos, and I am the Center for Puerto Rican Studies Director of Public Policy, External and Media Relations, and I will be serving as your Masters of Ceremonies this evening for Puerto Rican Migrants, Farm Workers, Enduring Experiences in Continental U.S. Agriculture, a webinar on the e-journal exhibit by Professor Ismael García Colón. On behalf of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, I welcome you. The Puerto Rican Migrants, Farm Workers, Enduring Experiences in Continental U.S. Agriculture explores the long history of the administrative and legislative attempts to manage farm labor migration and the experiences of migrant farm workers. Of note is the role of the Puerto Rico Farm Labor Program, which existed between 1947 and 1993, which placed workers in more than 400,000 farm jobs, indirectly fostered the migration of thousands of non-contract workers and contributed to the emergence of many stateside Puerto Rican communities. This presentation is part of the CENTRO e-Journals initiative. The CENTRO e-Journals initiative is a peer review, or the journal is a peer review journal that publishes original contributions to Puerto Rican history and culture as interactive multimedia digital exhibitions online. It is fully devoted to promoting Centro's archival collections and other digital content, to increasing connections to Puerto Rican study scholars, curators, and artists, and to support historical and cultural preservation, as well as to educate about and to share broadly the Puerto Rican experience. As part of the Centro e-Journal initiative, we are seeking proposals for digital humanities projects that contribute to the historical and cultural preservation, is relevant to the field of Puerto Rican studies and the academic community, have a connection to or contribute to the Centro's library and archives, and have multimedia content to support users' interactivities. The Centro's e-Journal has a three-step assessment process for those interested in submitting proposals. The first one requires that the potential contributors submit a project proposal to the Centro e-Journal using the submission guidelines for authors and curators. Secondly, a proposal is accepted based on a peer review recommendations, exhibits that authors or curators will submit content as detailed in the proposal. The Centro Journal staff, the Centro e-Journal staff is committed to support the exhibit development and complete the uploading of content. And then thirdly, once the uploading and copyright clearance processes have concluded, the link to the unpublished exhibit is sent to the peer review panel for final evaluation. Reviewers will read and review all materials and confirm that the recommendations in this stage of the process were followed and that the exhibit is ready for publications. Once the exhibit is ready for publication, we encourage authors or curators to submit a summative and interpretative article about the exhibit to the Centro Journal for its from the Centro Archives section. So if you have any questions or would like to get additional information, please contact us at Centro e-Journal at hunter.cuny.edu. Dr. Ismael García Colón, who is professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in the College of Staten Island, part of CUNY, our sister institution, and in the Department of Anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center. He is a historical and political anthropologist with interest in political economy, oral history, migration, Gramsci's concept of hegemony, farm labor, race and citizenship, U.S. empire, and U.S. ethnic and racial history. His research experiences include documenting Latinxs and in New York City labor movements, and conducting ethnographic research on landless workers, migrant farm workers, colonial state formation, and land distribution programs in Puerto Rico. García Colón is the author of the recently published Colonial Migrants at the Heart of Empire, Puerto Rican Workers on U.S. Farms, by the University of California Press, 2020, and also Land Reform in Puerto Rico, Modernizing the Colonial State, published by the University of Florida in 2009. His publications have also appeared in Latin American Perspective, the CENTRO Journal, American Ethnologist, Latino Studies, and Dialectical Anthropology. His current research explores the Puerto Rican experience in U.S. farm labor and its relations to U.S. colonialism and immigration policies, and how government policies and workers form and transform modern subjectivities in Puerto Rico, as we will be able to discern for the presentation this evening. In addition to Dr. Garcia Colón, we are joined by Dr. Teresita Levy, who is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies and the Executive Director of the Office of International Programs and Community Engagement at Lehman College. Dr. Levy is a trained historian and quantitative researcher, teaching courses on the history of Latin America and the Caribbean and their diasporas. Her research focuses on economic history of the Spanish Caribbean. Her book, Puerto Ricans in the Empire, Tobacco Growers and U.S. Colonialism, was published by Rutgers University Press in 2014. Dr. Levy is also a qualitative researcher, moderating groups and conducting in-depth interviews throughout the United States in English and in Spanish for over the past 20 years. She has worked with the governmental agencies, such as the New York City Office of Emergency Management, the Department of Health, the Mayor's Office, Board of Education, etc. She has a PhD and a Master's of Philosophy from the History Department at the Graduate Center and an MS in Counseling from Long Island University CW Post Campus. I welcome both Dr. Garcia Colón and Dr. Levy. And with that, and without further ado, I present you with Dr. Garcia Colón's presentation.
The digital exhibition, Puerto Rican Migrant Farmworkers, Enduring Experiences in Continental U.S. Agriculture, showcases the lives of those migrant farm workers and the history of the farm labor program, which was established in 1947 by the government of Puerto Rico under the Department of Labor and its Bureau of Employment and Migration. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, the government, led by the Popular Democratic Party, was engaged in a political project to transform the islands from an agrarian rural society into an industrial and urban one. As part of these efforts and emulating New Deal initiatives like the photographic documentation of the historical division of the Farm Security Administration, Puerto Rican officials created new agencies with photographers, writers, and graphic artists to provide materials to influence public opinion and support its policies of migration, modernization, and development. Earlier, the Tocqueville administration from 1941 to 1946 in Puerto Rico had established the Office of Information and hired North American photographers to promote the social transformations carried out by its New Deal-inspired programs. Among the photographers were Jack Delano and Charles Rodkin, who had worked for the Farm Security Administration. These documentation efforts continued under the Jesus de Piñero and Luis Muñoz Marin administrations. In 1949, the government of Puerto Rico established the Division of Community Education, which published posters, films, photographs, and pamphlets. The Bureau of Employment and Migration and its division, Migration Division, also documented and produced photograph literature and films on the Puerto Rican experience with farm labor migration. In the late 1980s, the Department of Puerto Rican Community Affairs replaced the Migration Division, but continued its initiatives. Some of the publications and photographs used in this exhibit are the result of the efforts of the government of Puerto Rico to promote the farm labor program to audiences in the continental United States and Puerto Rico. These include many records, film posters, photographs, and brochures in the archival collections of the offices of the government of Puerto Rico in the United States, housed in the archives of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. These records document the history of Puerto Rican migrant farm workers in the United States. The digital presentation of Puerto Rican migrant farm workers' enduring experiences in continental U.S. agriculture is divided in 4 sections. The first section explored the causes that spurred Puerto Ricans to migrate and the government of Puerto Rico to manage the flow of Puerto Rican farm labor migration during the late 1940s. The second section described the establishment of the farm labor program. 2 more sections follow that include the government's implementation of the farm labor program and the legacies of farm labor migration. These 4 sections provide a chronological and processual description of Puerto Rican farm labor migration during the 46-year tenure of the farm labor program. The first section on the background of farm labor migration deals with the living conditions prevalent in Puerto Rico during the 1930s and 1940s. Agriculture was the main economic activity in Puerto Rico during these decades. The first image in the exhibition is a photo depicting a rural family husking corn. Widespread poverty and in some cases landlessness and lack of access to health care plagued the Puerto Rican countryside. Housing was another major concern, as depicted in the second image, with overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in the islands. These were among the factors that impelled many rural families in Puerto Rico to migrate stateside. Section 2 documents the establishment of the farm labor program in 1947. In the late 1940s, the United States granted self-rule to Puerto Rico, allowing the election of the governor. The legislature, controlled by the Popular Democratic Party, a pro-New Deal political party, began to deepen the politics of modernization and development, and also to implement population control through migration. By providing temporary jobs to agricultural workers in the continental United States, the government sought to improve the standard of living in the countryside. One of the items in the exhibit is a pamphlet distributed by the Division of Community Education that presents facts about labor migration and advises the population about the challenges it entailed. In this section, the photos depict the recruitment and transformation of migrant workers. The government of Puerto Rico built an infrastructure for migration with offices and procedures that announced and explained the opportunities as well as recruitment and travel, including what to do upon arrival in the United States and the supervision and distribution of workers to farms. Instituting the contract of the Puerto Rican Farm Labor Program involved the establishment of an infrastructure of offices, personnel, and public relations. For example, the government of Puerto Rico issued brochures for farmers in order to facilitate the hiring of workers and dispel negative stereotypes about migrant workers. Section 3 of the exhibition explored the implementation of the program and the interventions of the government of Puerto Rico in farm labor migration. As some images in this section illustrate, migrant workers spent most of their time on the mainland in labor camps. The Glass labor camp in New Jersey was the largest labor camp in the United States Northeast. It housed Puerto Rican workers from the early 1940s through the early 1990s. The conditions in the labor camps varied, but were generally overcrowded and unsanitary. At Glassboro, missionaries, residents of nearby towns, and government officials provided entertainment, recreational facilities, English classes, and health services, among other government-sponsored services. Some of the photographs document the visits and presence of Puerto Rican officials in the camps, like Governor Luis Muñoz Marín, the Secretary of Labor, Fernando Sierra Verdecilla, and the Director of the Migration Division, Joseph Montserrat. The final section of the exhibit analyzes the legacies of Puerto Rican farm labor migration. The farm labor program facilitated the migration of thousands of Puerto Rican workers who usually faced discrimination and prejudice from the local populations. Even though the Puerto Rican government also published books and articles to educate the general population and reminding them that Puerto Ricans were, like them, U.S. citizens. The final impulse of the farm labor program followed the government of Puerto Rico's establishment of the Department of Puerto Rican Community Affairs in the United States, which oversaw the farm labor program until 1993. And this ended when the Rosselló González administration decided to terminate the farm labor program and eliminate the Department of Puerto Rican Community Affairs. One of the efforts carried out by the department was to formally document Puerto Rican migration. It created an archive and commissioned photographer Doel Vázquez to document Puerto Rican migrant farm workers. Vázquez captured many of the interactions and lives of Puerto Rican migrant workers in the fields, like picking fruit or being transported to the fields. A graph in this section illustrates the flows of Puerto Rican contract workers during the 46 years of the farm labor program, demonstrating how the end of the Mexican Bracero program led to the increase of the Puerto Rican contract labor migration in the late 1960s and to its decrease as undocumented migration increased in the United States and the labor climate turned against Puerto Rican farm workers in the late 1970s. The Puerto Rican farm labor program placed men in more than 400,000 farm jobs, indirectly fostering the migration of thousands of non-contract workers and the emergence of many stateside Puerto Rican communities. Puerto Ricans constituted more than 60,000 farm workers per year at the peak of their migration during the late 1960s and early 1970s. One of the main goals of this exhibition is to highlight the hidden histories of Puerto Rican migrant workers. Thousands of migrant workers were pioneered in the establishment of the state Puerto Rican communities. Their contributions and experiences have an important place in the history of Puerto Rican migration to the United States. it is also imperative to look at the relationship of their history to both the history of migrant farm labor to the United States and the influence of US immigration policies. Puerto Ricans share with Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans a legacy of labor exploitation and dispossession, as well as a struggle to make a living and fight for their civil rights. These histories are integral to the building of the United States as a nation in the 20th century, in particular to how the country produces and consumes its food. The exhibit, Puerto Rican Migrant Farmworkers: Enduring Experiences in Continental U.S. Agriculture, will give faculty and students the opportunity to explore their relationship to the production of food that depends on migrant farm workers, the definitions of U.S. citizenship for minority groups like Puerto Ricans, the legacies of U.S. colonialism and imperialism, the impact of photography in documenting social change, and the roles of the government of Puerto Rico in fostering and managing migration. The topic of Puerto Rican farm labor migration, and therefore this exhibit remains relevant to courses on U.S. history, the food studies, and social, ethnic, racial, and labor studies.
Thank you, Ismael. Hi, everybody. This is Teresita Levy. I am so pleased to be your commentator today. And I want to thank you for having me. It is such a pleasure to be here at Centro to talk about Puerto Rico, and especially to talk about agriculture and the people that are involved in it, the subject of my own work. So I want to thank Ismael for writing his incredible book and also curating this much needed exhibit. I have some comments, and probably not fully thought out yet, just questions, observations, areas of inquiry. And I don't have any answers. My intention is that my comments spark some thoughts of your own, and that they allow us to begin a conversation and debate about the history of Puerto Rico and the experience of the Puerto Rican people. So welcome to my rabbit hole, as my teenagers would tell me when I go on a stream of consciousness. Please bear with me. I want to start with a comment about the study of the history of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. Many years ago, I don't know who, someone decided that the history of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans should be separated, that it should be studied, researched, and analyzed from an either aquí perspective on the island in Puerto Rico, or an allá framework on the mainland in New York, or Philadelphia, or Lorraine. And look at what I just did, right? Even in the way that I just framed this short argument, I just revealed my own bias. Aquí still means the island to me, and allá means the United States, even though I have lived allá longer than I ever lived aquí. So perhaps allá is now aquí. But anyway, I digress. So those of us that became scholars, that study, research, and analyze our complex and fascinating history, have often bought into this bifurcation, either becoming specialists on island history, art, culture, literature, or becoming experts on the diaspora. And look, this makes sense, right? The two fields of study are enormous and deserve specific and dedicated attention. But I think what this exhibit does so well is that it forces us to think about an integrated study of the island and its people. The story of farm migration and the farm labor program has two beginnings, one in Puerto Rico and the other in the bracero programs of the United States, aquí and allá. The story of the people that participated in that program also has two theaters. One includes the Puerto Ricans that decided to migrate from the island looking for opportunity, and the other includes the communities that were created as a result of that migration, aquí and allá, integrated. And I keep thinking that this is the way that the study of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans has to move forward, that the stories, especially after 1950, are intrinsically linked, and that one side, either aquí or allá, can no longer be a footnote to the other. Nor are these stories and events occurring in a social, political, and economic vacuum that excludes either aquí or allá. So I guess I would just encourage my colleagues and our students and anybody interested that we think of the history of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans as one history. And how do we do that? Well, I told you I didn't really have any answers, but I would like to offer that as a point of departure of debate and discussion as we think about the information presented in this exhibit and the others exhibit at Centro. So let's talk for a moment about the exhibit, which, as Ismael told you already, narrates the history of Puerto Rican farm labor migration to farms in the US and the different aspects of the farm labor program. I kept coming back to the photos of the recruitment lines, those chairs on the planes, and imagining the terrible, in many cases, living and working conditions of the farm workers. I want to borrow from Ismael when he talks about the history of Puerto Rican migration as one fraught with ironies and contradictions, which is, by the way, a fantastic way to describe the history of our relationship with the empire. Here's an irony. Puerto Rican workers are less desirable than workers in guest labor programs, as Ismael argues. Citizenship made them less desirable because it grants them rights. The same colonial status that granted them access in the first place is what now makes them undesirable. Here's another irony or contradiction. The government of Puerto Rico saw migration as a tool of population control, as an engine to economic development, right? To better conditions on the island, we had to make people move or encourage people to leave the island. Here's another one. Growing seasons were complementary, and this is one of those weird coincidences, but of course, there are no coincidences, I've been told. January to June is the growing season in Puerto Rico, and the slow season from July to December made farm workers available for the harvests in the Northeast of the United States. And we know that Puerto Ricans moved inside within the island from area to area to area, depending on where the growing was happening, from tobacco to coffee to sugar. No, so not such a stretch that they would think about working July to December in the US. Here's another one, another irony for you. People stayed. When they migrated and they finished their work, their contract, they stayed, right? These resulting Puerto Rican communities were cause of concern for officials here in the United States, but also for Puerto Rican officials who were forced to constantly explain that Puerto Ricans were US citizens, that they belonged there, that they had a right to be there, and like other citizens were able to settle without any special permission from immigration. Here's another irony. The expansion and contraction of the farm labor program, and Ismael does a really fantastic job of talking about how many people when, did not truly respond to other economic pressures as we would expect, like most market-driven processes. Instead, it responded to immigration policies, right? Even that lawsuit that Ismael begins his article with, it is responding to immigration policies. It is not responding to a market-driven economic process. That is interesting to me. It's actually fascinating. And I keep thinking that this is another one of those colonial particularities that only exist in Puerto Rico, or because of the situation in Puerto Rico. Okay, and talking about colonialism, here's the last one. It was colonialism that allowed the farm labor program to exist. And this may be the greatest irony of all, right? And it may be the greatest of all the contradictions. Puerto Ricans as colonial subjects were directly affected by policies tied to the needs of the empire, changed by the whim of elected officials and employers. And in fact, look, if you think about the ending of the program in 1993, it wasn't, again, responding to market forces. It was part of a much larger campaign to, quote, eliminate all obstacles to statehood, embarked upon by the Rosselló administration. I was thinking about my own experience growing up in Puerto Rico, where I was born and where I studied until I came to the US mainland to attend college. And, you know, I had no idea that the farm labor program existed. I was just told that, you know, some of us cruzamos el charco, we came over, right? And even in my one Puerto Rican history class, which was senior year of high school, and by the way, have you thought about the irony in that we are taught our own history in the last year of our schooling? It's really interesting. Even that class did not mention this program. Why is that? I wanna ask this, and I want us to talk about this. Are we embarrassed on the island to call it our own? To know how much responsibility we bear, not the empire, but us for what happened, right? And what this exhibit made me realize, along with Ismael's book and other recent publications on the topic of migration, like Eileen Finley's work, was how coordinated, how crafted the migration process was on the island, which was led by Puerto Rican officials, managed by Puerto Rican managers, sold as a good program to Puerto Ricans by other Puerto Ricans. And if you know my work, and I know there are some of you in here that do, you know that I want accountability. I want responsibility. I want us to think about those things. I want us to think how we contribute for the state of the island. And this exhibit is a perfect example of taking responsibility. Of course, this didn't happen without the colonial structures in place that allowed this program to happen and that supported it for so long. But let's think about the ways that Puerto Ricans participate in our own everyday doing. And in this program in particular, Ismael told you, they created English language programs, they supervised the living and working conditions and labor camps. They even produced literature, it's beautiful literature, to promote the hiring of Puerto Rican farm workers among stateside farmers. There were offices in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Camden, Hartford, Chicago, and Cleveland, all places where today there are significant populations of communities of Puerto Ricans. We're talking about more than 400,000 jobs before the program was done, 60,000 a year at the peak of the program. What responsibility do we bear? It's not just the evil empire, right? We participated in this. Just some thoughts for you to digest. And one last comment before I ask Ismael to join us. I look at this exhibit and I am forced to think about food production in this country and respect, or lack thereof, for the workers, especially the migrant farm workers that are very much a part of our daily sustenance. Farm labor is still immigrant work, right? The lowest of the low, meant now for undocumented people. Ismael argues that Puerto Ricans became undesirable workers, that employers prefer to hire undocumented workers than Puerto Rican workers. Why? Because they can be deported, they can be abused, they can be asked to work unimaginable hours, live in unimaginable conditions, move their family from farm to farm to farm to farm, because they do not have the same rights as a citizen worker would have. Undesirable workers, what a terrible word to use when we talk about human beings, undesirable. All right, I'm gonna stop, or if not, I may just take you all the way to Wonderland if you keep going with me down this rabbit hole. I want to invite Ismael and Carlos, Ismael to join me for some additional comments, and Carlos to help us out with the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Teresita. Thank you, Ismael. I mean, this has been, first of all, a wonderful presentation and mind-blowing commentary, Teresita. I love it. We do have a number of questions that Ismael has already begun to answer, but I think that they're fascinating, and I think that, I want to give the opportunity to the members of the audience who've joined us to perhaps hear some of their responses. And Ismael, so I'm going to ask you to perhaps repeat yourself in some of these answers. A couple of them ask about registries of laborers, right? Are there any reports or data, a website or an agency of Puerto Rican farm workers from the 1950s to the present? Are there roles, are there rosters? I mean, Some people would like to know where their grandparents worked when they came to the United States. Where can people find, if there is any way of finding, where their ancestors worked if they were part of the farm labor program?
The archives of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies hold the collections of the offices of Puerto Rico in the United States. And the section on the Migration Division and its farm labor program has first passenger manifests. So if you know the date where your ancestor migrated to the United States, you can go to the passenger manifests and may find the person. Another collection within the Migration Division is the collection of identification. The government of Puerto Rico provided IDs to Puerto Rican migrants because there was always this confusion if Puerto Ricans were citizens or not. So the government of Puerto Rico provided identifications. So in order for Puerto Ricans to prove that they were US citizens. So you can use, if your ancestor apply for an ID, you may find that person I believe the Centro has a database, and you will be able to find your ancestor.
Very well, thank you.
Let me just add that in terms of information, general information about this migration, the reports of the Migration Division contain specific data about the regions that the migrants arrived and the places of origin in Puerto Rico, at least by region. In Puerto Rico, but this varies from year to year, from season to season in the 46 years.
Well, another question, and thank you for that answer, Ismael. So yes, to reiterate, the documents of the Migration Division are found in the Center for Puerto Rican Studies Library and Archives. So people can approach our archivists and our librarians and request to perhaps view these documents that are part of the trove of information that we have at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. There is also a question that is more experiential to some extent. And I think that Teresita did a wonderful analysis in how the growing seasons in Puerto Rico and the harvest, most importantly, are sequential, right? They are sequential in Puerto Rico. They're also sequential in the United States, and that allow Puerto Ricans to move from places to places in Puerto Rico, and then also then to the United States. One of the question is, how did the experience of these migrant farm workers compare, perhaps, the ones that migrated, compared to the ones that perhaps did not migrate, the ones who stayed behind in Puerto Rico, right? So, and that also raises the question, what proportion of farm workers migrated versus those that never migrated? I don't know if you have that information handy, but just by staying with the experiential nature, how might the experience of the farm worker that migrated compare to that to the one that never migrated?
I mean, there's no data about how many of the people that migrated were farm workers. This information, I mean, varies from, like I said, from year to year. In terms of the experiences, it's like Teresita was saying, this is difficult to separate the stateside from the island, because in most of these cases, these were males, right? The men, the heads of the family that left their family initially in Puerto Rico. So some of them will send money, other will save money until they could bring their families from Puerto Rico. So there was not, it's difficult to say, oh, the ones that stayed had a different life, yes, or in a sense, but they may be the parents of some of the people that migrated, and the people that migrated were sending them money, remittances that they used to open maybe a store or to build a house. So to separate both experiences is not as useful as seeing the complexity of migration and the communities of origin of these migrants.
Mhm, mhm.
And if I
Teresita,
can
sí.
just interject just something quick, I think that, you know, in what we know about Puerto Rico from the 50s to the 90s in terms of agriculture is that there is this steep decline in production, which any of you that know Puerto Rican history know this, and that people were moving from the rural areas to the urban centers, but that many people chose to stay in the countryside. And this, we don't know if they chose to stay because life in the countryside was better for them, or because they were being helped with support from the families, or there were social programs that helped them out. We don't have that kind of qualitative information. We do know that there were, from the census data, we can see that the number of farm workers really declined, the number of production declined, the number of farms declined after really in the late 1950s, we're seeing a major decline. But I also know anecdotally from my students at Lehman that I've had in my classroom that tell me I used to pick tobacco when I was a kid, because in the 70s, people were still living off of picking tobacco. So that's one comment. And then the other one is when we talk about farm laborers, we have to think about the different zones like coffee, tobacco, citrus, sugar, because the experience of those laborers was incredibly different in terms of depending on the crop that they were growing. Thanks, Carlos.
Yeah, yeah. Another question, another experiential question. This one speaks about, could you please speak about the migration to Hawaii and how many survived the journey? And it's interesting because even though that migration to Hawaii was also sponsored by the Puerto Rico government, the colonial government in Puerto Rico, it was not necessarily sponsored by the Migration Division or the Farm Labor Program. So for either one of you, what do we know about the migration of Puerto Rican farm workers from Puerto Rico to Hawaii?
I will say that that migration is very important. It happened I believe in 1900, immediately after the U.S. invasion, and it shows how the demand from labor from Puerto Rico that sugar companies had and for labor, and how they use Puerto Rican workers to, in a way, fulfill that demand, but at the same time play with ethnic divisions in the island of Hawaii. It was because first, when the United States invaded Puerto Rico and Hawaii, migration laws then applied to both islands. And the Chinese Exclusion Act applied to the island of Hawaii. There was a large migration of Asians to Chinese to Hawaii. These workers were very organized, and they were striking against the sugar corporations, and these sugar corporations then began to try to find alternative sources of labor. And then you have Puerto Ricans, the government of Puerto Rico at that time, as soon as the United States invaded, right? The first report is that the island is overpopulated, there's a lot of poverty, what do we do with these people? And one of the first governors, Charles Allen, he began to promote the migration of Puerto Ricans to Hawaii, but also to other territories within the control of the US empire, like Cuba at that time.
Mhm. And we know, Teresita, I don't know if you want to add, but we know that on their way to Hawaii, many hopped off the train. Many went, they went from by boat from Puerto Rico to New Orleans, and then they took a train, and they came off the train sometimes before reaching even the West Coast. They might have stayed in Arizona, they might have stayed in San Francisco, how the San Francisco community started, and then ultimately a few of them did reach Hawaii and did form a Puerto Rican community. So one of the oldest Puerto Rican communities in the United States is that in Hawaii, right? Uh, in terms of how many survived the journey, there might have been some documentation of that, perhaps, since it was sponsored by labor recruiters with the acquiescence of the Puerto Rico colonial government. But I certainly don't have that information handy. Do any one of you have any knowledge of that? Yeah, that's a little bit nitty gritty information, right?
I mean, we know that there were around 10,000 Puerto Ricans in the first decade of the 20th century in Hawaii.
Mhm, mhm.
That's what I understand.
There are more questions about the experience of these migrants. This one's in New Jersey, perhaps. Ralph is asking, is there any idea of what these migrants were paid? And here it's interesting because since this was a sponsored migration, a government sponsored migration, a lot of the work was done and arranged by the government of Puerto Rico, but also done informally, correct? So were there wage differentials among the farm workers? I'm expanding on the question, actually. Or
Mhm.
were there wage differentials based on whether they were coming from or with the farm labor program, or if they came independently of the labor program? Do you have any sense?
Yes. Well, most were migrating because they wanted to have jobs, right, and earn some income. So, uh, for example, if I take the year of 1966, worker in the tobacco region of Puerto Rico will make maybe 45 cents an hour, and traveling as a migrant farm workers under the contract of the government of Puerto Rico, they could make $1.40 an hour. And a worker without a contract under the government of Puerto Rico could make between $1 or $1.10. And again, all this varies by year. But Puerto Rican farm workers under the contract began earning around 45 cents in 1947, and they ended up earning $5 and around 50 cents by 1993.
Mhm. And how would that compare to the wages they would have earned in Puerto Rico on the one hand, or the wages they would have earned, say, in the United States outside of a farm setting? Do we have a sense?
Um, in well, in Puerto Rico, like I said, it was from $45 to $1.40. In 1966, that was a big difference.
Yeah.
And also there was more job during the harvest, so that they will work practically 7 days a week, and some cases 12 hours a day. So they will be able to make a substantial amount of money during the period of the harvest. And in some cases, it varies by industry. In the United States, some workers will make around the same kind working in the cities in the mid 1960s. but it varies by industry too, and by the city and the region in the United States.
A point that both of you made, and I don't know if you want to add, Teresita, but a point of that either one of you, that both of you made, is the fact that these programs contributed to the establishments of Puerto Rican communities through the United States. We know that one of the characteristics of the Puerto Rican experience has been its dispersion. It's not just New York City, it's not just Hawaii, but we are spread throughout the United States, particularly throughout the Northeast, and that is growing even more so now. What communities can we identify that were founded, established, nurtured, grown by the workers that started coming through this program? Do we have a sense?
I will say more. I will say more. Most.
All of them, I would say.
Except the larger cities, like I mean, New York. You will have to not include New York City and maybe Chicago, but maybe you will have to include Philadelphia. You have places like in New Jersey, Violent, Perth Amboy, in Pennsylvania, Lancaster. There's a town in the lakes, around the lakes in Pennsylvania, Erie, that city. There are Puerto Ricans there because of farm labor. In Massachusetts, Holyoke, in Illinois, in Ohio, there are places where the first Puerto Ricans were farm workers. So I will say most of the small communities were established by Puerto Rican farm workers.
And that is obvious.
I would just say, Carlos, I'm sorry, that many of the communities in Connecticut, except for maybe the ones in large cities, are all related to tobacco workers who went, farm workers who went to pick tobacco.
And similarly with Western New York,
Right.
etc., correct?
Yes.
And you have written about perhaps Michigan, etc. The point is that, again, most of the migrants who remain, and this is another question, actually the question is how many actually stayed in the United States after the contracts expired. Many stay behind, and those were the kernels that established these communities outside of the bigger population centers. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, if you go to this, some of these places that I mentioned, like Lancaster, Pennsylvania, you talk to elderly Puerto Ricans and they will say that they first arrived as migrant farm workers.
This other question is about agency and about the documentation of that agency of these farm workers. And it says, is there any depository of correspondence from farm workers to their families and or officials back on the island, voicing their complaints of their working conditions?
I mean, in the island, in the Archivo General de Puerto Rico, there are collections of the Department of Labor that contain this type of letters, actually of their wives looking for help when their husbands were having problems after migrating with or without contracts, but also the collections at the Central Archives contain letters from relatives, some cases, some families looking for their families that had left as migrant farm workers and they didn't know, they didn't have news about them, or when some workers got sick or died, and then the government officials had to contact the family in Puerto Rico.
And we have those images of Governor Luis Muñoz Marín, along with the Secretary of Labor, Sierra Verdecia, and the Migration Division head, Joseph Montserrat. And many of them came to the United States as a result of complaints from farm workers. Was not that the case?
Yes, I mean, the government of Puerto Rico had one of the reasons why they have the Migration Division was to make sure that they could resolve any problems that the Puerto Ricans had, so that will not have a negative impact in the political life in Puerto Rico for the Popular Democratic Party. So they, you know, they had really good public relations campaign. When something happened, they would visit the communities, visit the farm workers, trying to resolve the problems to avoid any embarrassing news or situations for the government.
And why is that?
Well,
what were they trying to sanitize news about Puerto Rican farm laborers in the United States?
Well, because one is to remain in power, right? To maintain the electoral support of the population. I mean, one of the biggest supporters in Puerto Rico of the Popular Democratic Party was the rural population, right? The same people that were migrating, and also to avoid problems like trying to, I mean, people asking the government to send them back to Puerto Rico or avoid social problems that were happening within the families in Puerto Rico, or when the migrants brought their families to the stateside.
I have a lot of questions here that are coming up, and I think that I can organize them between those that entail particularly the migrants' experience, and then perhaps the consequences of migration for both Puerto Rico, etc. So I think I'm gonna begin with the more personal, individual, or collective experience of the farm workers, and then we can go over to bigger, more structural, and perhaps institutional aspects. This other question talks about in what ways did labor organizing in stateside communities that were primarily populated by agrarian workers compared to the political organizing patterns that characterize urban communities? I mean, that's a big question. I don't know if that is your area of expertise, but at least from the side of the farm worker, how was that organizing developed? How did farm workers organize themselves?
Farm workers in general in the United States are mostly unorganized because farm work is not included within the National Labor Relations Act. So it makes very difficult for farm workers to organize themselves, or even other unions to organize farm workers. In the history of Puerto Rican farm workers, what we can see is that in the late 1960s, when there was a really strong Puerto Rican community in the stateside, there were more labor and radical movements being established within the Puerto Rican community. Then you see the beginning of trying to organize Puerto Rican farm workers. By the mid-1970s, some of those organizing farm workers were able, together with the migrants, to establish what was known as ATA, the Asociación de Trabajadores Agrícolas, the Agricultural Workers Association. It was initially established in Connecticut among tobacco workers that work for a large association of tobacco growers, and also in New Jersey. ATA wasn't successful because of financial difficulties. It tried to ally itself with the United Farm Workers Union, but those efforts failed. And by the early 1980s, a new organization was created in New Jersey in the area of Glassboro and Vineland in southern New Jersey, known as CATA. CATA still exists in southern New Jersey. The Comité de Apoyo para los Trabajadores Agrícolas, the Workers Support Committee, and CATA was successful in organizing workers during the 1980s, but eventually the efforts, it is very difficult for farm labor organizations to remain and to be really strong, because you have this population that is changing constantly. CATA now serves mostly immigrant farm workers, but CATA used to have also offices in Puerto Rico, right, to try to organize in both places. But the forces against labor organization in farm labor are stronger than labor organizations in farm labor. This is something that that we still need to work with.
Another question on the experience of farm workers and now beginning to see what impact farm workers migration had on Puerto Rico and their families in Puerto Rico is around remittances, economic remittances. The question says, do you cover economic remittances in your book? Do you know if this has been covered at all in the Puerto Rico literature, or has been a practice that was never really documented? What impact do remittances, either the monthly literal sending over of monies from farm workers on the one hand, or perhaps others, as well as coming back home with their pockets full of money? What impact would that have, not just for their families, but for the local communities? I mean, what was the effect, essentially, I would say, the economic impact of these farm workers once they returned to Puerto Rico, or certainly for their families if their families remained in Puerto Rico?
The data is not complete. It's here and there, like in the I remember seeing that in the early 1950s, like 1953, like it was almost $1 million. But there's not a good documentation of those remittances. What I can tell you is that they were so important that for example, in southern New Jersey, where most of this migration concentrated, and in the Glassboro labor camp, the largest labor camps with Puerto Ricans in the United States, the government of Puerto Rico provided services of money orders to workers. So they were really into the workers, promoting them to send money to Puerto Rico. In terms of the effects, is case by case. What I have found talking to farm workers is that many of them build their houses, or they went back, opened stores in Puerto Rico. They send their children to university. Some of them now, still 10 years ago when I saw some farm workers, they were still, some of them migrating from the late 1950s and early 1960s, and they were doing that because they had loans to pay. They had grandchildren not and children to feed. So you know the impact is it has not been measured because quantitatively we don't have that information, but in qualitative we can say that it has been very important, but in the historiography has not been of Puerto Rico, it has not been considered.
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, and the same way that, nowadays they may use, remittance services, whether it is Western Union or something else. There are also informal, more personal. Here, let me give you this envelope. Can you give it to my wife, or can you give it to my daughter? And that is much harder to quantify then and account for that. I mean, I know that Jorge Duani, in talking about remittances in Puerto Rico, he says that it tended to be undercounted because many people might have just sent a check, and that doesn't get captured as a remittance, or cash with somebody who may be traveling down to the island, etc. Another question that talks about the impact of migration, farm migration, in Puerto Rico is: did the farm workers migration program help increase the economic activity of Puerto Rico? Did lowering unemployment rates or increasing GDP, or having less workers on the main economic sector in Puerto Rico decrease the economic activity during that time? And I know that, Teresita, you've also done some work along this line, so, feel free to jump in as well.
What we know, right, the unemployment rates in Puerto Rico remain really steady during this migration. So what we can imagine is that they would have increased because what Teresita mentioned, there was a lot of, there was a decrease of agricultural jobs in Puerto Rico during this period. So the people were migrating, and the government of Puerto Rico then was not, I mean, that was their strategy, right? To try to decrease unemployment, but what they really were achieving was to maintain the same rate of unemployment.
Right, that's exactly, I was gonna say the same thing. And I think that where you see it allowed for the Puerto Rican government and the architects of Operation Bootstrap and the supporters of Operation Bootstrap to really talk about victory in a way that if you really look at the numbers, wouldn't have held up. If that population, if you send away 20% of your working age population, you are going to have impact in unemployment. And the way that we see the impact is, even when things were tough, unemployment stays the same, right? So what you are doing is, it's like releasing the pressure of a pot, right? You're allowing people to leave, keeping your numbers steady, regardless of how much unemployment is actually increasing. So we do know that there is an incredible decrease of opportunities for farm jobs. And remember that the original idea of Operation Bootstrap was not to substitute a new sector for agriculture. It was to add an employment sector. But what happened was, as humans do, people moved from the countryside to the cities. The jobs were better, they were less taxing, they paid better, right? So all of these things come into play. So the impact of the migrant, it's really hard to talk about remittances and sort of what the actual dollar value is of the money that was coming in, or the money that people were sending, or what people were saving, or did they buy property with migrant farm labor wages, right? It's really hard to quantify that, but really looking at unemployment really shows us that the migration program had an enormous impact on the so-called success of industrialization programs.
And it's interesting because obviously, as the economy in Puerto Rico shifted radically from mostly agricultural to one that was industrial to then one that is post-industrial and focused more on the service sector and commerce, you see that those workers, the ones who remain as farm workers, they may be farm workers, Puerto Rican farm workers in the United States, but they may not be engaged in farm work in Puerto Rico. They may be engaged in other activities in Puerto Rico. Is that correct?
Yes, this is the sample I've remembered. This farm worker that I interviewed in Southern New Jersey maybe 14 years ago, and he had he began migrating in the 1950s, and he was still a migrant farm workers. And he will say that some years he will, in a row, he will migrate to the farms, but other times he will find jobs in factories in the island or around Philadelphia. You know, every time that he didn't have a job, then he would use migrant farm labor as a way of subsist.
Mhm. So chileando almost, it becomes one of those skills that become handy when there is no other opportunity, or that becomes an opportunity that opens up and allows you to, earn some money. But it is farm work is not only heavy, heavy labor, but it's also heavy in that it is a tough sector of the economy to be in as a full-time employee year round. Is that so?
Yes, because I mean, it's the harvest, right? Especially in the Northeast, you have winter, and you cannot cultivate the land at all during winter. So usually for farm workers, jobs start like around March, April, and they last until from September to November. And you will have maybe different rotating crops from maybe vegetables at the beginning or of the harvest. Maybe during the summer you will have fruits, corn, and so on until they depart back to Puerto Rico.
Another question, and we've talked a little bit about the political economy of farm labor. Let's talk about the political implications, the political implications that the farm labor program and the ending of the farm labor program had. This question reads, can either scholar elaborate on how ending the program in 1993 was meant to support or fuel statehood, independence, and perhaps what it has actually accomplished on both of these fronts? What might be some of the political, partisan, or statehood, status-based repercussions that the farm labor program might have had?
I would say that there are two different ideologies intersecting at the time of that the program was eliminated in 1993. First is a statehood, right? The Rosselló González government achieved during the 1990s to eliminate many of the programs that remain that the Popular Democratic had established, which were on these ideologies of the New Deal and the welfare state. But then you have also neoliberalism, right? The Rosselló González, although it began before with Hernández Colón, and maybe you can trace this to Ferré in the early 1970s. Neoliberalism is very strong in the 1990s in Puerto Rico within the Rosselló administration, and eliminating a program that the government had to bring workers to the United States. It makes sense within an ideology that seeks the elimination of government services and reduce of government. Basically, the government led the workers to migrate by themselves in the 1990s without providing any protections, to the point that 3 or 4 years ago, there were complaints in these Alaska food processing factories about the labor conditions that Puerto Ricans had. And of course, the Ricky Rosselló, the son of Rosselló Gonzalez, was arguing that that was going to be investigated. But of course, we had Hurricane Maria, and that I'm sure that didn't end up in anything. It wasn't investigated at all.
Teresita.
I mean, I think that there, this idea of removing obstacles to statehood really was pervasive at this time. And you're right, Ismael, the philosophy of neoliberalism really just takes off at this time. It's everywhere. And it's all about privatizing state enterprise. And it's all about where the government is inefficient. And so we should privatize everything. And you can't privatize migration. I mean, I suppose you can if you think about some of the services that we see today, like moving and money moving services and all of those things, right? But I think what is interesting to me, it's all of these, and ironic perhaps to use your word, is all of these programs that were implemented and that use the colonial structure as a way to be able to set up these programs, right? It allowed it to happen, are being eliminated as a way to say, like, we are not a colony. We need to be part of the State of the Union. And I think that's where the political, where there is a manipulation perhaps of what it means to be a state, or what are the obstacles to being a state, right? Which is fascinating to me, because the real obstacle to being a state really is Congress, right? So it's really interesting that there is this sense of, let's get rid of public corporations, state-run corporations. Let's get rid of the migration program. Puerto Ricans, we're not going to call Puerto Ricans migrants because we don't want to be migrants if we're going to be a state, right? Let's get rid of, there were so many, let's make English. There was an English language thing too, wasn't there? Like about English being the official language again. Do you remember? I'm trying to think of what this was, but all of these obstacles towards statehood are interesting to me. Anyway, that was my comment.
Teresita, Ismael, thank you. This has been both a wonderful presentation and insightful commentary of an often forgotten aspects of our history as a people in the United States, and they have been wonderful. I really thank you for the time you've taken to put in this work together and for sharing this information with us, your audience.